The morning of June 4th, 1942, began with confidence aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, still recovering from appendicitis but unable to stay below decks during such a momentous operation, stood on the flight deck watching the first wave of strike aircraft launch toward Midway Atoll. The engines roared. The deck crews moved with practiced efficiency. Everything proceeded according to plan. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's intelligence officers had assured him that the American carrier force, what little remained of it, was over 1,000 miles away, still licking its wounds near Pearl Harbor. The Japanese fleet would strike Midway, eliminate the American airbase, and draw out whatever scattered forces the United States Navy could muster for a decisive battle on Japan's terms. But within hours, radio operators would begin reporting something impossible. Scouts were counting American carriers, not one, not two, 3 carriers, then 4. Then numbers that made no sense at all. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Japanese air crews were reporting encounters with aircraft from 7 different American carriers, when Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence had confidently assessed that the United States had exactly 3 operational carriers in the entire Pacific, and none of them were supposed to be anywhere near Midway. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This wasn't merely a tactical surprise. This was a complete intelligence collapse that shattered the foundational assumptions upon which Japan's entire Pacific strategy rested. The story of what happened in those chaotic hours off Midway is not simply about a battle won or lost. It's about the terrifying moment when an entire military command structure realized that everything they thought they knew about their enemy's capabilities was, catastrophically, dangerously wrong. And the reverberations of that realization would echo through every strategic decision Japan made for the remainder of the war. To understand the depth of this intelligence failure, we must first understand what Japanese naval commanders believed about American carrier strength in early June of 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy's intelligence apparatus, primarily centered in the 3rd Bureau of the Naval General Staff, had been tracking American carrier movements since before Pearl Harbor. Their assessment process combined signals intelligence, submarine reconnaissance, radio direction finding, and reports from agents in places like Hawaii and the Panama Canal Zone. By their calculation, completed in late May of 1942, the situation looked remarkably favorable for Japan. The intelligence summary presented to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was precise and seemingly authoritative. The aircraft carrier USS Lexington had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8th. The carrier USS Yorktown had been severely damaged in the same engagement and, according to Japanese intelligence estimates, would require months of repair work at a mainland shipyard. The carrier USS Saratoga had been torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in January and remained under repair on the American west coast. That left exactly 3 operational American carriers in the Pacific: USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Wasp. Furthermore, Japanese intelligence placed these carriers in defensive positions near the Hawaiian Islands, certainly not in a position to interfere with the Midway operation, which Japanese planners had deliberately scheduled to give the Americans insufficient time to react and concentrate their forces. This assessment wasn't the product of lazy analysis. Japanese naval intelligence had legitimate sources of information and had demonstrated real competence in previous operations. Their radio intelligence service, particularly the code-breaking sections, had achieved notable successes against certain American codes. Their submarine reconnaissance network had accurately tracked some American ship movements. The problem wasn't incompetence. The problem was a combination of rigid assumptions, confirmation bias, and an opponent who had learned to exploit Japanese intelligence collection methods. The Japanese believed that major damage to an American carrier would require extensive repair time because that's how Japanese shipyards operated. Japanese industrial capacity, stretched thin by the demands of a multi-front war, couldn't rapidly repair major warship damage. Therefore, Japanese intelligence analysts assumed American shipyards operated under similar constraints. When submarine reconnaissance and signals intelligence seemed to confirm that Yorktown had indeed left the Coral Sea badly damaged and had been tracked to Pearl Harbor. Japanese intelligence concluded what seemed logical. The ship would be out of action for at least 3 months, possibly longer. This assumption cascaded through the entire Midway planning process. Admiral Yamamoto's operational plan relied on the calculation that Japan could mass 6 fleet carriers against at most 2 or 3 American carriers. The odds seemed overwhelming. Japanese naval aviation had demonstrated its superiority at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, and across the Pacific. Japanese aircrew training was superior. Japanese carrier doctrine was more aggressive. Japanese torpedoes were vastly more reliable than their American counterparts. Even if the Americans somehow managed to get their carriers into position, which seemed unlikely given the intelligence assessment, Japan would still hold every advantage. Vice Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force, received his final intelligence briefing on June 2nd, just 2 days before the attack on Midway. The assessment remained unchanged. No American carriers were in the vicinity of Midway. The American garrison on the atoll itself would be neutralized by carrier strikes, and then the Japanese invasion force would land and secure the island. If American carriers did eventually respond, perhaps in a week or more, they would be walking into a carefully prepared trap, with Japanese submarines positioned along their approach routes and the full might of the combined fleet ready to engage them in the decisive battle Japan had sought since the war began. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's brilliant air operations officer, felt some unease about the intelligence picture, but even he didn't question the fundamental assessment. The concern wasn't whether American carriers might already be present that seemed impossible given the confirmed intelligence, but rather about the tactical complications of striking both the Midway installations and any American carriers that might appear later. The Japanese strike plan accounted for this by preparing a reserve strike force that could be rapidly rearmed and launched against surface targets if enemy ships appeared. Everything seemed professionally planned. Everything seemed to account for the known variables. And that was the trap. Japanese planning accounted for known variables. It accounted for the enemy they expected to face. It did not account for an enemy who had systematically deceived them about carrier availability, who had accomplished what Japanese engineers considered impossible in repairing the Yorktown, and who had broken Japanese naval codes thoroughly enough to know not just that Midway was the target, but when the attack would come. The foundation of Japanese confidence rested on 3 pillars: superior intelligence, superior forces, and superior doctrine. By the morning of June 4th, the first pillar had already crumbled without anyone in the Japanese fleet realizing it. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming. They knew the date, they knew the plan, and they had concentrated every available carrier, including one that the Japanese believed was still in dry dock, to meet the threat. Aboard the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, positioned in ambush northeast of Midway, the intelligence picture looked entirely different. American codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, had achieved something the Japanese considered virtually impossible. They had broken enough of the Japanese naval code JN-25 to read significant portions of Japanese operational communications. They knew Midway was the target. They knew approximately when the attack would come, and they had given Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, the priceless gift of time to prepare. The USS Yorktown represented perhaps the most dramatic symbol of American determination and industrial capability. The carrier had indeed been badly damaged at Coral Sea, just as Japanese intelligence knew. What Japanese intelligence didn't know, couldn't imagine, was that American shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor would accomplish in 72 hours what Japanese analysts assumed would take 90 days. Working around the clock, repair crews patched the Yorktown's damaged hull, repaired her elevators, restored her power systems, and got her back to sea in time to make the desperate run to Midway. She wasn't fully repaired. Her fuel bunkers still leaked. Some damage control systems remained improvised. But she could launch aircraft, and in early June of 1942, that was all that mattered. The Japanese had counted on fighting 2 American carriers, maybe 3 if they were unlucky. Instead, 3 American carriers, all of them concentrated, all of them positioned in ambush, all of them forewarned waited in the darkness northeast of Midway as the Japanese fleet approached. The first Japanese scout planes, launched in the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th. Standard doctrine called for a comprehensive search pattern radiating out from the carrier force to identify any enemy surface forces before committing to the Midway strike. But the search pattern that morning was neither comprehensive nor timely. One scout plane from the cruiser Tone launched 30 minutes late due to a catapult malfunction. That single mechanical delay would prove catastrophic. The search plane that should have been covering the sector where the American carriers actually sat didn't reach its search area until the crucial early morning hours had already passed. Meanwhile, the first wave of Japanese strike aircraft, 108 planes, roared off toward Midway. They bombed the American installations, encountering fierce anti-aircraft fire and determined if somewhat ineffective resistance from the American fighters based on the island. The strike damaged but didn't destroy the American base. The strike, commander radioed back. A second strike would be necessary. This recommendation triggered one of the most fateful decisions in naval history. His reserve strike force, 93 aircraft, was armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships, just in case American carriers appeared, as the operational plan anticipated. But if Midway required a second strike, those aircraft would need to be rearmed with general-purpose bombs and fragmentation munitions suitable for attacking land installations. The intelligence assessment said no American carriers were in the area. The returning strike leader said Midway needed another attack. At 07:15, Nagumo ordered the reserve strike rearmed for a second attack on Midway. 15 minutes later, at 07:28, the scout plane from the cruiser Tone, the one that had launched late, sent a message that shattered the morning's certainty. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The reaction aboard Akagi's bridge was immediate and electric. Enemy ships. But what kind? Carriers? Cruisers? The message didn't specify. Nagumo immediately ordered the scout to clarify ship types, but radio communication in combat conditions was neither instant nor reliable. The rearming operation below decks, already underway, created chaos, as ordnance crews now faced the prospect of switching back to anti-ship weapons. Torpedoes that had been removed were still sitting on deck dollies. Bombs intended for land targets were being loaded onto aircraft. The hangars became a dangerous tangle of munitions, aircraft, fuel lines, and increasingly frantic deck crews. At 08:09, after an agonizing 40-minute delay, the scout plane sent the message that turned tactical confusion into strategic nightmare. Enemy ships appear to be 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No carriers. Nagumo's operations staff allowed themselves to breathe. Cruisers and destroyers could be dealt with. The first strike wave against Midway, now returning and low on fuel, could land and be rearmed. Then the entire Japanese carrier force could turn and destroy this American surface group. But at 08:20, another message arrived. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. One carrier. This changed everything. One carrier meant the Americans had somehow gotten a single flat top into position, probably the Enterprise or Hornet. Still manageable, but now the tactical situation demanded immediate attention. Nagumo ordered the rearming operation to focus on anti-ship weapons, but the hangars were already in chaos. Half-armed aircraft shared deck space with fuel lines, munitions carts, and the returning Midway strike force now circling overhead, desperately low on fuel. What happened next would be pieced together only later from survivor accounts, radio intercepts, and the confused reports of pilots who lived through the morning. Because the reality bearing down on the Japanese fleet was far worse than one American carrier. It was far worse than anything Japanese intelligence had prepared them to face. American dive bombers had launched from all 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the supposedly crippled Yorktown hours earlier. They'd flown long, fuel-draining search patterns trying to locate the Japanese fleet. The initial attacks, by torpedo bombers, had been slaughtered. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore through the slow, low-flying American torpedo planes with devastating efficiency. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. For the Japanese fighter pilots and anti-aircraft crews, it seemed like another demonstration of Japanese superiority. The Americans were brave but outmatched. But those massacred torpedo squadrons had accomplished something crucial. They had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. The Zeros were low. Their pilots focused on finishing off the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers were in the middle of the most vulnerable operation in naval aviation, recovering and rearming aircraft. The flight decks were crowded. The hangars were packed with aircraft, fuel lines connected, ordnance scattered everywhere. At precisely 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise, having searched far beyond their planned range and nearly ready to turn back from fuel exhaustion, spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. McCluskey made the calculated guess that the destroyer was racing to rejoin the main fleet. He followed the wake. 4 minutes later, McCluskey's radio crackled with the signal every dive bomber pilot dreamed of hearing. Enemy carriers, directly below, completely unprepared. What the Japanese carriers' lookouts saw next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Out of the high cloud cover, American dive bombers appeared not from one direction, but from multiple vectors. Enterprise's bombers hit Akagi and Kaga almost simultaneously. Yorktown's bombers struck Soryu moments later. The timing was a pure accident, but the effect was devastating. In the span of 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers were transformed from the most powerful naval aviation platforms in the Pacific into floating pyres. The accounts of Japanese survivors describe a kind of mechanical horror. The first bomb hit Akagi near the midship elevator. The explosion threw the elevator platform into the air and sent burning aviation fuel cascading through the hangar deck. Aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs, fuel tanks topped off, all packed together in the confined space, began to explode in chain reactions. Firefighting efforts were immediately overwhelmed. The ship's damage control systems, designed to handle single impacts from conventional bombs, couldn't cope with the cascading internal explosions. Kaga took 4 direct hits in rapid succession. 1 bomb penetrated to the hangar deck and detonated among the rearming aircraft. Another hit forward, igniting fuel storage areas. The ship's skipper, Captain Jisaku Okada, tried to maintain control, but the fires spread faster than damage control parties could respond. Crew members trapped below decks faced the choice of burning to death or leaping into the ocean. Soryu, the smallest of the Japanese fleet carriers, took 3 direct hits. 1 bomb struck the flight deck forward, penetrating the hangar and igniting parked aircraft. Within minutes, the entire forward section of the ship was engulfed. The crew's desperate attempts to jettison burning aircraft and ordnance couldn't keep pace with the spreading flames. The common factor in all 3 catastrophic losses was timing. The carriers were caught with their decks crowded, their hangars packed, with armed and fueled aircraft, and their damage control parties already stretched thin from the morning's frenetic rearming operations. Under normal circumstances, Japanese carriers were incredibly resilient ships. But caught in the absolute worst moment of their operational cycle, they were transformed into death traps. For the radio operators and intelligence officers still functioning in what remained of the Japanese command structure, the messages flooding in made no sense. Pilots were reporting attacks from aircraft marked with insignia they didn't recognize, different carrier identification numbers, different squadrons. The organizational chaos of the American strike, which had seemed like a liability when torpedo squadrons attacked piecemeal and got slaughtered, now appeared in a different light. These weren't just scattered squadrons from 1 or 2 carriers. This was a mass strike from multiple fleet carriers. Aboard the surviving carrier Hiryu, still undamaged because she'd been operating separately from the other 3 carriers, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi tried to piece together what was happening. His intelligence officers showed him the pilot reports. Enterprise-based aircraft, Hornet-based aircraft. Yorktown-based aircraft, 3 carriers. But the plot thickened further when pilots reported attacking an American carrier and clearly identifying it as Yorktown, the ship that was supposed to be in dry dock in Hawaii, undergoing repairs that shouldn't be complete until August at the earliest. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Japanese commanders had built their entire operational plan on intelligence that told them they would face at most 2 carriers, probably only 1, possibly none. Instead, they were facing 3 carriers, including one that shouldn't even be capable of operating. What else was the intelligence wrong about? How many other carriers might the Americans have available? If they could repair battle, damage in days when it should take months, what did that say about American industrial capacity? Japanese radio operators, trained to monitor American communications and track squadron identifications, began compiling reports that seemed increasingly impossible. They were logging contacts with air groups from Enterprise, from Hornet, from Yorktown, but they were also logging what appeared to be aircraft from additional carrier units, planes with markings and radio call signs that didn't match the known 3 carriers. Some pilots reported encountering aircraft with markings suggesting they came from Saratoga. Other reports suggested WASP-based aircraft. The radio intelligence sections knew this was impossible. Saratoga was supposed to be on the west coast. WASP was supposed to be in the Atlantic. But the reports kept coming. What the Japanese couldn't realize in the chaos and confusion of combat was that American air groups had been significantly reorganized after the Coral Sea battle. Squadron identifications and aircraft markings didn't always correspond neatly to their current carrier assignments. Replacement aircraft carried old markings. Pilots transferred between carriers brought their squadron identities with them. The organizational fluidity that characterized American carrier aviation in the early 1942 created an intelligence picture that appeared to show far more carriers than actually existed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But from the Japanese perspective, sitting in the ruins of what had been the most powerful carrier strike force in the world, this confusion translated into a terrifying possibility. Maybe American intelligence about Japanese plans had been perfect, and maybe the Americans had pulled together every available carrier in the Pacific, including carriers that shouldn't be, operational for this single decisive battle. The afternoon of June 4th brought home the full scope of the disaster. Hiryu's counterstrikes had found and badly damaged Yorktown, giving Japanese aviators a brief moment of hope that they might salvage something from the catastrophe. But American dive bombers found Hiryu in late afternoon and repeated the morning's devastation. By sunset, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were sinking or abandoned, burning hulks drifting in the Pacific. The intelligence assessments had to be revised in real time, but each revision only deepened the mystery. Initial battle reports suggested Japanese forces had engaged 3 American carriers. As more pilot debriefings were conducted and radio intercepts analyzed, that number climbed. 4 carriers, 5 carriers. By some counts, based on the variety of aircraft types, squadron markings, and radio call signs encountered, Japanese intelligence officers were seeing evidence of 6 or possibly 7 different American carrier air groups participating in the battle. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Admiral Yamamoto's senior staff officer, spent the evening of June 4th trying to make sense of the intelligence reports. The numbers didn't add up. Japan had sunk Lexington at Coral Sea that was confirmed by multiple sources. Saratoga was on the west coast, undergoing repairs that seemed solid based on signals intelligence. WASP was in the Atlantic, multiple intelligence sources confirmed this. Yorktown should be in dry dock, requiring months of repair. That left Enterprise and Hornet as the only operational carriers in the Pacific. 2 carriers. But the battle reports described encounters with at least 3 carrier air groups, possibly 4, maybe more. The only way to reconcile the intelligence assessment with battlefield reality was to conclude one of 2 possibilities. Either American industrial capacity was so overwhelming that they could repair catastrophic battle damage in a matter of days, or Japanese intelligence had fundamentally miscounted the number of carriers America had available in the Pacific theater. Both conclusions were terrifying. If Americans could repair carriers in days when it took Japanese shipyards months, what did that suggest about the broader industrial and technological balance? If Japanese intelligence had miscounted American carrier strength by a factor of 2 or 3, what else might they be wrong about? The interrogation of American prisoners captured from shot-down aircraft provided little clarity. American pilots often didn't know which other carriers were participating in the operation. Security protocols meant that aircrew from one carrier had limited knowledge of overall force composition. When questioned about how many American carriers were present, prisoners gave varying answers. Some said 2, some said 3, one insisted there were 4. Meanwhile, Japanese search planes, submarines trying to track the American fleet after the battle reported conflicting sightings. Multiple carriers were spotted in positions that suggested either an impossibly large American force or multiple sightings of the same carriers as they maneuvered. The intelligence picture dissolved into confusion precisely when clarity was most desperately needed. The intelligence failure at Midway wasn't simply a matter of miscounting ships. It represented a systemic breakdown in how the Imperial Japanese Navy understood its opponent. In the weeks following the battle, as the full scope of the disaster became clear, Japanese intelligence officers began the painful process of reconstructing what had actually happened. Their findings would force a fundamental reassessment of American capabilities, but that reassessment came too late to change the strategic trajectory of the war. Commander Toshikazu Ome, a staff officer in the Naval General Staff's Operations Section, was assigned to compile a comprehensive analysis of the Midway defeat. His task required piecing together scattered pilot reports, radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and the handful of photographs taken during the battle. What emerged was a picture that challenged everything Japanese naval intelligence had believed about their enemy. The first revelation concerned Yorktown. American prisoners confirmed that the carrier had indeed been present at Midway, operating normally despite having been severely damaged at Coral Sea just a month earlier. When Japanese interrogators pressed for details about how such rapid repairs were possible, the American aircrew seemed genuinely confused by the question. To them, it was simply what happened. Damaged ships went to Pearl Harbor, repair crews worked around the clock, and ships returned to action. The idea that this represented something unusual, some demonstration of superior industrial capability, didn't register with the American prisoners. It was just a normal procedure. This casual attitude toward accomplishing what Japanese engineers considered nearly impossible was perhaps more disturbing than the feat itself. It suggested a depth of industrial capacity so vast that extraordinary efforts registered as routine operations. Japanese naval architects calculated that repairing Yorktown's documented damage should have required at least 8 weeks in a fully equipped naval shipyard. The Americans had done it in 72 hours at a forward base that Japan had supposedly crippled 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor. The analysis of American carrier strength proved even more troubling. By carefully cross-referencing pilot reports, radio call signs, aircraft serial numbers visible in reconnaissance photographs, and squadron identifications, Japanese intelligence eventually confirmed that 3 American carriers had been present at Midway: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Not 7, not 6, 3. But those 3 carriers had put up aircraft in such numbers, with such organizational flexibility, and with such variety in markings and identifications that Japanese observers had genuinely believed they were facing a much larger force. This realization led to a second, more disturbing question. If 3 American carriers could be mistaken for 7, how accurate were Japanese assessments of American carrier construction programs? Japanese intelligence knew that America had multiple new carriers under construction. The Essex-class program was no secret. Intelligence sources had identified contracts for at least 10 new fleet carriers, but Japanese planning assumed these ships would take 2 to 3 years to build and work up to operational status. If American shipyards could repair catastrophic battle damage in days, what did that suggest about their ability to construct new ships? Captain Kameto Kuroshima's post-battle analysis included a sobering calculation. At current American construction rates, which Japanese intelligence had previously dismissed as propaganda, the United States would have more fleet carriers operational by mid-1943 than Japan could possibly build in the entire war. And if American industry could actually achieve the acceleration that now seemed possible given the Yorktown repair, the carrier balance would shift decisively to America by early 1944 at the latest. The strategic implications were profound. Japan's entire war plan had been predicated on winning a decisive victory in the first 6 to 12 months of conflict, then negotiating a favorable peace from a position of strength. The Midway operation was supposed to be the decisive battle, the engagement that would shatter American carrier strength and force Washington to negotiate. Instead, Midway had shattered Japanese carrier strength while revealing that American industrial capacity was even more formidable than the most pessimistic Japanese estimates had suggested. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the revised intelligence assessments in the week following Midway. According to officers who were present, Yamamoto read the reports in silence, then made a statement that would be remembered by everyone in the room. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant, and all we have done is given him time to prepare." Whether Yamamoto actually spoke those exact words has been debated by historians, but multiple officers recalled him expressing deep pessimism about Japan's long-term prospects after learning the true scope of American industrial capacity. The intelligence failure extended beyond simple ship counts. Japanese planning had assumed that American naval aviation would require months or years to reach the skill level of Japanese carrier aircrew. Japanese pilots trained for years before being assigned to carrier squadrons. Japanese doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, better to have fewer, superbly trained pilots than masses of mediocre ones. But at Midway, American pilots who Japanese intelligence assessed as inferior had achieved a decisive victory. They'd done it not through superior training or better aircraft, but through better intelligence, better timing, and the sheer weight of numbers that American training programs could produce. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's torpedo squadron from Hornet had been wiped out almost to the last man. Only one pilot survived. From a Japanese tactical perspective, this seemed to confirm assumptions about American inferiority, but the strategic reality was different. America could replace those 30 pilots in months. Japan couldn't replace its lost carrier pilots, the irreplaceable veterans who had struck Pearl Harbor and who now rested on the bottom of the Pacific for years, if ever. The training pipeline couldn't sustain the losses. This asymmetry became apparent in the intelligence assessments compiled through the summer of 1942. Japanese intelligence officers calculating American pilot training capacity came to a shocking conclusion. American flight schools were graduating more carrier-qualified pilots every month than Japan graduated in a year. Even accounting for lower individual skill levels, the sheer volume of American aviation training meant that any war of attrition would inevitably favor the United States. The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership was complicated and contradictory. On one level, the intelligence revelations after Midway forced a realistic assessment of American strength. The myth of easy victory evaporated. But on another level, the very scale of American industrial advantage made it psychologically difficult to accept. If America truly possessed such overwhelming material superiority, then Japan's entire war strategy had been based on a delusion from the beginning. This was not a conclusion that senior officers could easily accept or publicly acknowledge. Instead, Japanese strategic planning after Midway entered a phase that historians would later characterize as denial, mixed with desperate gambling. Unable to accept that the war was unwinnable, Japanese planners focused on scenarios where superior Japanese fighting spirit, better tactics, or favorable circumstances might compensate for material disadvantage. Each plan relied on Americans making mistakes, on battles occurring in circumstances that favored Japanese strengths, on American will collapse before American industry reached its full potential. The intelligence community found itself in an impossible position. Analysts who provided realistic assessments of American strength were sometimes dismissed as defeatist, Reports that accurately quantified the growing American advantage in carriers, aircraft production, and pilot training were politically unacceptable to commanders committed to finding a path to victory. Gradually, intelligence reporting became less candid, more focused on tactical details, and less on strategic realities. Commander Chikataka Nakajima, serving in the intelligence section of the Combined Fleet Staff, later described the atmosphere after Midway as one of enforced optimism. Everyone knew the strategic situation was deteriorating. Everyone understood that American carrier strength was growing while Japanese strength diminished. But the institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy made it nearly impossible to have frank discussions about the implications. Instead, planning focused on the next decisive battle, the next opportunity to turn the tide, always with the assumption that superior Japanese skill and determination would overcome material disadvantage. The specific question of how many American carriers actually existed continued to plague Japanese intelligence throughout the war. The Midway confusion established a pattern where Japanese commanders consistently overestimated American carrier strength in the short term while underestimating the long-term growth of American carrier construction. Battle reports from Guadalcanal, the Santa Cruz Islands, and later engagements repeatedly claimed more American carriers sunk or damaged than actually existed. This wasn't simply wishful thinking or deliberate misreporting, though both occurred but reflected genuine difficulties in accurately identifying and counting American carriers under combat conditions. American carriers of the Essex class, which began entering service in late 1942, looked similar enough that distinguishing individual ships from aerial reconnaissance photographs or distant visual sightings was extremely difficult. Japanese intelligence tried to track individual carriers by monitoring radio call signs, but American radio discipline and frequent call sign changes made this method unreliable. The result was a persistent uncertainty about American carrier strength that made operational planning extremely difficult. By mid-1943, Japanese intelligence estimates of American carrier strength in the Pacific ranged from 8 to 14 fleet carriers, depending on which intelligence source was considered most reliable. The actual number was 10, still more than enough to achieve overwhelming superiority, but not quite as many as the highest estimates suggested. But this uncertainty itself became a strategic problem. Japanese commanders planning operations couldn't be certain whether they would face 3 American carriers or 8. This uncertainty forced more conservative operational planning and made it harder to concentrate Japanese forces effectively. The broader strategic implications of the Midway intelligence failure rippled through Japanese war planning in ways that became apparent only gradually. Before Midway, Japanese strategy had been offensive: seize territory, establish a defensive perimeter, force the Americans to attack fortified positions on unfavorable terms. After Midway, with carrier strength inadequate to support major offensive operations, Japanese strategy became increasingly reactive. Instead of choosing when and where to fight, Japan found itself responding to American initiatives. This strategic shift was directly related to the intelligence revelations. If American carrier construction was producing new ships as rapidly as revised intelligence estimates suggested, then time was working against Japan. Every month that passed meant more American carriers, more American aircraft, more American pilots entering the Pacific theater. The logical strategic response would have been to seek negotiated peace as quickly as possible, before American material superiority became overwhelming. But domestic political factors, cultural commitments to military honor, and the Allies' unconditional surrender doctrine made negotiated peace impossible. Instead, Japanese strategy devolved into a series of defensive battles, each intended to inflict enough casualties on American forces to make continued offensive operations too costly. This attrition strategy had a fatal flaw that Japanese intelligence officers recognized but couldn't overcome. America's industrial capacity meant that it could sustain far higher losses than Japan and still maintain offensive pressure. Every battle became a race between American material advantages and Japanese tactical skill, a race that Japan was steadily losing. The intelligence failure at Midway also affected Japanese perceptions of American military culture in ways that influenced tactical and strategic decisions throughout the war. Before Midway, Japanese doctrine emphasized the importance of morale, fighting spirit, and willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives. American forces were stereotyped as materialistic, soft, and lacking the spiritual qualities necessary for sustained combat. The fighting at Coral Sea and the early Guadalcanal operations seemed to confirm this: American forces were tough but not superhuman, and they could be beaten by determined Japanese attacks. But the Torpedo Squadron massacre at Midway, where American pilots pressed home attacks despite catastrophic losses, challenged these stereotypes. Japanese after-action reports noted the surprising determination and reckless courage of American torpedo bomber crews. These weren't the actions of soft, materialistic soldiers unwilling to die for their cause. These were warriors fighting with the same commitment to mission that Japanese doctrine celebrated. This created cognitive dissonance in Japanese military culture. If Americans could match Japanese fighting spirit and possessed overwhelming material superiority, then what was the basis for believing Japan could win? The answer, increasingly, was that there was no rational basis, only hope, desperation, and cultural imperatives that made surrender unthinkable. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and who observed the Midway battle despite his medical condition, spent months after the battle trying to understand what had gone wrong. His analysis, later published in Japanese naval journals, focused extensively on the intelligence failure. Fuchida argued that Japanese intelligence had made a fundamental mistake. They had collected vast amounts of tactical data about American ships, aircraft, and bases, but had failed to understand American strategic capabilities and decision-making processes. Knowing that Yorktown was damaged at Coral Sea was tactical intelligence. Understanding that American industrial culture would throw unlimited resources at repairing the ship in time for Midway was strategic intelligence. Japanese intelligence had the first, but completely lacked the second. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Japanese intelligence could tell you the technical specifications of an American carrier, the number of aircraft it carried, even the names of its senior officers. But Japanese intelligence couldn't tell you that American shipyards would produce new carriers faster than Japan could sink them, or that American industrial capacity would expand faster than Japanese attacks could damage it. The prisoner interrogations conducted after Midway provided hints of this deeper American capability, but Japanese intelligence officers struggled to interpret the information correctly. American prisoners spoke casually about the size of their training bases, the number of aircraft factories back home, the scale of shipyard operations. To the Americans, these were just facts. To Japanese interrogators, trained to protect sensitive information about Japanese industrial capacity, this openness seemed like either psychological warfare or evidence that the prisoners didn't actually know sensitive information. The truth that American industrial capacity was so vast that specific production numbers weren't particularly sensitive was difficult for Japanese intelligence to accept. Japan's entire wartime economy operated under severe resource constraints. Steel production was limited. Aircraft manufacturing capacity was stretched thin. Every ship, every aircraft, every trained pilot represented a precious resource that couldn't easily be replaced. The idea that America operated under completely different constraints, where resources were abundant and bottlenecks were organizational rather than material, didn't fit Japanese officers' understanding of industrial warfare. This fundamental misunderstanding of American economic capacity persisted throughout the war. Japanese intelligence continued to calculate American production potential using Japanese industrial capacity as a baseline, applying multipliers to account for America's larger economy. But this method consistently underestimated actual American output because it assumed Japanese-style resource constraints that didn't apply to the American economy. When American shipyards started launching new Essex-class carriers at monthly intervals in 1943, Japanese intelligence officers initially assumed the reports were propaganda. No navy could build fleet carriers that quickly. When reconnaissance confirmed the reports, the conclusion was even more disturbing. America wasn't just larger than Japan, it operated on a completely different scale. The strategic implications of this realization were profound and depressing. If America could outproduce Japan by factors of 5 or 10 to 1 in critical systems like carriers and aircraft, then every battle became counterproductive. Sinking one American carrier just meant that 2 new ones would enter service before Japan could build a replacement. Shooting down American aircraft meant exhausting precious ammunition and wearing down irreplaceable pilots, while America's aircraft factories and training schools produced ever more replacements. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto, wrote in his diary in August of 1942 that the revised intelligence estimates about American production capacity had forced him to reconsider Japan's entire strategic position. He calculated that even if Japanese forces achieved favorable exchange ratios in every subsequent battle, sinking 2 American ships for every Japanese ship lost, destroying 2 American aircraft for every Japanese aircraft lost, America's production advantage would still result in growing American superiority over time. The mathematics of industrial warfare were inexorable, and they favored the side with greater economic capacity. This recognition led to increasing desperation in Japanese strategic planning. If conventional military operations couldn't overcome American material advantages, then perhaps unconventional approaches might work. This logic eventually contributed to decisions like the Kaiten torpedo program and the kamikaze campaigns, attempts to use tactics that American industrial propulsor capacity couldn't easily counter. These were the strategies of a military establishment that understood it was losing, but couldn't accept surrender. The intelligence officers who had compiled the pre-Midway assessments faced no formal consequences for their failure. Some were quietly reassigned. Others continued in their positions, now tasked with providing more accurate estimates. But the institutional culture that had produced the intelligence failure remained largely unchanged. The same structural problems that led analysts to underestimate American carrier availability continued to bias intelligence assessments throughout the war. Part of the problem was that Japanese military culture made it professionally dangerous to deliver bad news. Intelligence officers who provided pessimistic assessments risked being labeled defeatist. Reports that emphasized American strengths or Japanese weaknesses were sometimes suppressed or softened before reaching decision-makers. This created a feedback loop where intelligence gradually diverged from reality, with analysts telling commanders what they wanted to hear rather than what the evidence actually suggested. Commander Nakajima later described this dynamic in his post-war memoir. "We knew the Americans were stronger than our reports indicated. We knew their industrial capacity exceeded our estimates. But to say so openly was to invite accusations of undermining morale. So we learned to present the truth in ways that seemed less discouraging. We emphasized areas where Japan still held advantages. We focused on tactical details rather than strategic realities. And gradually, our intelligence became less useful precisely because we were trying to make it more acceptable." The human cost of the intelligence failure extended far beyond the ships sunk at Midway. Every subsequent battle in the Pacific was fought by Japanese commanders operating with an incomplete and often inaccurate understanding of American capabilities. Pilots were sent on missions based on intelligence that underestimated American fighter strength. Ships were ordered to engage enemy forces that intelligence assessments had located incorrectly. Defensive positions were established based on predictions about American operational tempo that proved far too conservative. Each failed battle generated new intelligence about American capabilities, and each new intelligence report forced further revisions to Japanese understanding of their enemy. But these revisions always lagged behind American developments. By the time Japanese intelligence accurately assessed American capabilities at one point in time, American industry and training programs had already moved forward, creating new gaps between Japanese understanding and American reality. The final, bitter irony of the Midway intelligence failure was that the battle itself demonstrated many of the principles that Japanese doctrine emphasized: the importance of air superiority, the value of concentrating carrier forces, and the decisive impact of well-timed strikes. The Americans had won at Midway, by following these principles better than the Japanese. They had achieved air superiority by attacking Japanese carriers before Japanese strikes could be launched. They had concentrated their forces by bringing together every available carrier, despite the logistical and operational challenges. They had timed their strikes perfectly by using intelligence to position their carriers in ambush. In other words, America had won at Midway by being better at the operational and tactical concepts that Japanese doctrine claimed to master. This was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the defeat. It wasn't just a numerical defeat or a matter of being outproduced. The Americans had demonstrated that they could think strategically, operate effectively, and execute complex carrier operations at the highest level. The comfortable assumption that Japanese training and, quote, doctrine were inherently superior dissolved along with the burning carriers. For individual Japanese officers and sailors who survived Midway, the intelligence failure became a source of bitter reflection. They had gone into battle confident, believing their intelligence assessments, trusting that their commanders understood the strategic situation. Instead, they had sailed into an ambush, faced an enemy force far stronger than expected, and watched their carriers, the symbols of Japanese naval power, burn and sink within hours. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, a junior officer who survived the sinking of Kaga, later described his feelings upon learning after the battle that American intelligence had known the Japanese were coming. "We thought we were the hunters. We thought we had the advantage of surprise, superior intelligence, superior forces. Instead, we were hunted. The Americans knew we were coming. They knew when we would arrive. They knew our plan. And they had more carriers than we thought possible. Everything we believed about our enemy was wrong. That realization was more devastating than the loss of the ships. The shadow of the Midway intelligence failure hung over Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. In the months and years following the battle, a strange dynamic developed in Japanese intelligence assessments. Analysts simultaneously overestimated American strength in specific engagements while underestimating the long-term growth trajectory of American military power. This contradiction, tactical pessimism, combined with strategic optimism, reflected an intelligence apparatus trying to avoid another catastrophic surprise while maintaining enough hope to justify continued resistance. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August of 1942 illustrated this dynamic. Japanese search planes reported multiple American carrier contacts, leading commanders to believe they faced at least 4 enemy carriers. In reality, the American force consisted of 2 carriers, Enterprise and Saratoga. But the lesson of Midway, that American carrier strength could exceed expectations, had been learned too well. Now Japanese commanders saw phantom carriers in every radar contact and ambiguous sighting report. This overcounting of American strength led to overly cautious tactical decisions that sometimes allowed American forces to escape situations where aggressive Japanese action might have achieved better results. Conversely, Japanese strategic planning through late 1942 and into 1943 continued to underestimate the rate at which new American carriers would enter service. Intelligence reports acknowledged that multiple Essex-class carriers were under construction, but estimated their entry into service would be gradual, 1 or 2 ships every few months. The reality was far more aggressive. American shipyards, operating at a pace that Japanese industry couldn't match, were completing new fleet, carriers at intervals measured in weeks rather than months. By the first anniversary of Midway, in June of 1943, the strategic situation had evolved exactly as the post-Midway intelligence assessments had warned, but faster than even the pessimistic projections suggested. The United States now operated 9 fleet carriers in the Pacific, with more joining the fleet every month. Japan, which had begun the war with 10 fleet carriers, now had only 5 operational after the losses at Midway, battle damage to other carriers, and the slow pace of new construction. The carrier balance that Japanese war planning had assumed would favor Japan for at least 2 years had instead shifted decisively to America within 12 months. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, whose observations about the intelligence failure had been circulated among senior officers, watched this transformation with growing despair. In a letter to a fellow officer written in July of 1943, Fuchida wrote, We knew at Midway that our intelligence had failed us. What we did not know was how completely we had misunderstood our enemy's capacity to make war. Every month brings new reports of American carriers, American aircraft, and American submarines. Our pilots fight bravely, but they are fighting against mathematics. How do you defeat an enemy who can replace his losses faster than you can inflict them? This question, how to fight an enemy with overwhelming industrial capacity, became the central strategic dilemma for Japanese naval planning. The traditional answer in naval warfare was to avoid decisive battle, preserve your fleet, and wait for more favorable circumstances. But American submarines and aircraft were steadily destroying Japanese merchant shipping, cutting off the resource imports that Japan's economy required. Waiting meant growing weaker, while America grew stronger. Fighting meant accepting battles against superior forces. There was no good option, only less bad choices. The intelligence community struggled to provide actionable assessments in this deteriorating strategic environment. Accurately reporting American strength meant delivering consistently pessimistic reports that political and military leadership didn't want to hear. Underreporting American capabilities meant risking another Midway-style surprise. Intelligence officers navigated this tension by providing detailed tactical intelligence, accurate information about specific American units, their locations, their movements, while avoiding broader strategic assessments about long-term force ratios and industrial trends. This tactical focus served operational commanders relatively well in planning specific battles, but it created a strategic blind spot. Japanese war planning became increasingly short-term, focused on the next battle rather than the trajectory of the war. This wasn't simply denial or stupidity. Many Japanese officers understood perfectly well that the strategic situation was deteriorating. But institutional pressures, cultural factors, and the absence of any politically acceptable alternative to continued fighting meant that long-term strategic planning became almost impossible. The question of American carrier numbers continued to create intelligence challenges. The increasing similarity of Essex-class carriers made individual ship identification difficult. American operational security improved significantly after Midway, with better radio discipline and more sophisticated deception operations. Japanese intelligence officers found themselves working with fragmentary information, trying to track a growing fleet of carriers that often looked alike and operated in ways that made precise counting difficult. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence estimates of American fleet carrier strength in the Pacific ranged from 11 to 17 ships, with the uncertainty reflecting genuine difficulties in tracking individual vessels. The actual number fluctuated as new carriers entered service and damaged carriers withdrew for repairs, but was generally around 13 to 15 fleet carriers, close to the lower bound of Japanese estimates. However, this didn't mean Japanese intelligence was particularly accurate. The estimates were closer to correct, more by accident than through systematic accuracy. Different intelligence sections often provided different numbers, and the consensus estimate was sometimes just an average of contradictory reports. More troubling was the complete failure to anticipate the scale of American light carrier and escort carrier production. These smaller carriers, built on cruiser and merchant ship hulls, entered service in enormous numbers, far exceeding anything Japanese intelligence had predicted. By mid-1944, American light and escort carriers operating in the Pacific outnumbered the entire Japanese carrier fleet, including fleet carriers, light carriers, and converted ships. These vessels couldn't match fleet carriers in striking power, but they provided air cover for invasion forces, anti-submarine protection for convoys, and close air support for ground operations. Their sheer numbers meant that American amphibious operations could be supported by overwhelming air superiority that Japanese forces couldn't effectively contest. The intelligence failure extended to understanding American operational concepts. Japanese doctrine assumed that carriers would be used primarily for fleet engagements, major battles where carrier air groups would strike enemy fleets. American doctrine evolved differently, using carriers for a broader range of missions, including ground support, interdiction of Japanese shipping, and air superiority over invasion beaches. This operational flexibility, enabled by sheer numbers of carriers and aircraft, meant that American forces could conduct simultaneous operations across vast areas of the Pacific, while Japanese forces struggled to respond to multiple threats. Commander Nakajima, now serving as an intelligence officer for the combined fleet, compiled a report in March of 1944 that attempted to quantify American carrier operations over the previous year. His findings were sobering. American carriers had conducted operations on 147 separate days during 1943. They had struck targets across an arc spanning from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands, a distance of more than 5,000 miles. Japanese carriers, constrained by fuel shortages, maintenance requirements, and the need to preserve irreplaceable aircrew, had conducted significant operations in fewer than 40 days during the same period. This operational tempo disparity reflected the deeper industrial imbalance. American carriers could operate more aggressively because damaged ships could be quickly repaired, lost aircraft could be rapidly replaced, and casualty aircrew could be pulled from a training pipeline that graduated thousands of new pilots annually. Japanese carriers had to husband their resources because each loss was essentially irreplaceable. The strategic effect was that American carriers dominated the operational tempo, choosing when and where to fight, while Japanese carriers increasingly operated reactively, trying to respond to American initiatives. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 demonstrated both how much and how little Japanese intelligence had learned since Midway. Japanese planners knew that American carrier strength had grown dramatically. Intelligence estimates correctly identified 7 to 9 American fleet carriers, plus numerous light carriers supporting the Marianas invasion. Japanese commanders didn't make the mistake of underestimating American strength, if anything. Some estimates slightly overstated American carrier numbers. But knowing American strength and being able to effectively counter it were entirely different things. The Japanese plan relied on land-based aircraft from Guam and other islands, supplementing carrier aircraft to achieve local superiority. American fighters destroyed the land-based aircraft before they could effectively contribute. The resulting carrier battle became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a one-sided slaughter where American fighters shot down more than 600 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own. The intelligence failure wasn't about counting carriers. It was about failing to understand how completely American technology, training, and operational doctrine had evolved since Midway. Japanese pilots in 1944 were flying essentially the same aircraft as in 1942, but with significantly less training. American pilots were flying aircraft that were faster, more heavily armed, and more technologically sophisticated, and they had more training than their predecessors. The gap in quality had widened even faster than the gap in quantity. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier force at Philippine Sea, received intelligence reports before the battle that accurately described American carrier strength, but completely failed to communicate the qualitative changes in American carrier aviation. The intelligence briefings detailed American ship numbers, aircraft counts, and dispositions. What they didn't adequately convey was that American carrier groups now operated with radar-directed fighter interception, proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition, and pilot training programs that produced crews capable of executing complex operations at a tempo Japanese forces couldn't match. The result was another catastrophic defeat: 3 Japanese carriers sunk, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots killed, and the destruction of the last effective Japanese carrier strike capability. After the Philippine Sea, Japan still possessed carriers, but lacked sufficient trained aircrew and aircraft to operate them effectively as offensive weapons. The carriers became floating hangars, their flight decks empty or filled with aircraft that couldn't be effectively employed. Intelligence reports compiled after the Philippine Sea finally forced Japanese leadership to confront realities that had been apparent since Midway. American industrial capacity wasn't just larger than Japanese capacity. It was larger by factors so overwhelming that no plausible combination of tactical victories could overcome the strategic imbalance. Every major battle since Midway had confirmed this reality. Every intelligence update about American production showed the gap widening rather than narrowing. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, presented a strategic assessment to the Naval General Staff in July of 1944 that represented the culmination of 2 years of painful intelligence revisions. His report stated bluntly that American carrier strength now exceeded 15 fleet carriers, plus dozens of light and escort carriers. American pilot training programs were producing more combat-ready aviators every month than Japan's entire pilot corps. American aircraft production exceeded Japanese production by factors of 10 to 1 in most categories. American shipyards were launching new warships faster than Japanese submarines and aircraft could sink them. The report concluded with an assessment that would have been politically impossible to make 2 years earlier. The material balance of forces makes continued offensive operations impossible. American carrier strength will continue to grow while Japanese strength diminishes. No plausible sequence of tactical victories can alter this strategic trajectory. This assessment reached senior political and military leadership at a moment when the strategic situation made its conclusions undeniable. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, isolating Japanese garrisons, destroying Japanese shipping, and steadily moving closer to the Japanese home islands. The fantasies of a decisive battle that would turn the tide had evaporated. The intelligence services could no longer pretend that American strength was anything other than overwhelming. But acknowledging reality didn't provide an acceptable path forward. Allied demands for unconditional surrender meant that negotiated peace wasn't an option. Japanese political culture made surrender unthinkable for most military leaders. The result was a strategic paralysis where everyone understood that the war couldn't be won, but no one could articulate a politically acceptable alternative to fighting on. The intelligence community's role became increasingly tragic. Analysts compiled accurate reports about American strength, documenting the arrival of each new carrier, tracking the expansion of American air bases, and monitoring the growth of American forces. These reports were read, acknowledged, and then filed away as planning proceeded for operations that everyone knew had little chance of success. Intelligence became less about informing strategy and more about documenting the inevitable. Individual intelligence officers experienced this dynamic in deeply personal ways. Commander Nakajima, who had compiled some of the most brutally honest assessments about American industrial capacity, found his reports cited in planning documents, but his recommendations ignored. In his memoir, he described a meeting in late 1944 where he presented analysis showing that American carrier strength would exceed 20 fleet carriers by mid-1945. The officers around the table listened politely, asked clarifying questions about specific details, and then proceeded with plans that assumed American forces would be weaker, slower, and less capable than my intelligence clearly showed. Everyone knew the truth. No one could act on it. The Kaiten programmed suicide torpedoes, piloted by volunteers, and the kamikaze campaign emerged partly from this disconnect between intelligence, reality, and strategic impossibility. If conventional military operations couldn't overcome American material superiority, perhaps unconventional tactics that leveraged Japanese willingness to accept casualties might achieve what conventional operations couldn't. The logic was desperate, but desperation was the only logical response to a strategic situation that offered no good options. Intelligence reports about American carrier strength in the final year of the war took on an almost mechanical quality. Regular updates documenting the arrival of yet another Essex-class carrier, another wave of replacement aircraft, another class of trained pilots. By early 1945, American carrier strength in the Pacific exceeded 25 fleet and light carriers, not counting dozens of escort carriers. Japanese carrier strength had dwindled to a handful of ships, most lacking sufficient fuel, aircraft, or trained crews to operate effectively. The final carrier battle of the war, at Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, illustrated the complete collapse of Japanese carrier power. Japanese carriers served as decoys, successfully drawing American fast carriers away from the landing beaches, but the decoy carriers had so few aircraft that they couldn't even defend themselves effectively. American pilots found Japanese flight decks almost empty, the carriers reduced to bait rather than combat vessels. The intelligence reports compiled after later Gulf no longer needed to estimate American carrier strength or debate Japanese capabilities. The numbers were stark and undeniable. America had won the carrier war so completely that Japanese carriers no longer functioned as offensive weapons. For the Japanese officers and sailors who had experienced the intelligence failure at Midway firsthand, the trajectory of the war confirmed their worst fears. Ensign Sakamaki, who had survived Kaga's sinking, served on various ships through the rest of the war, watching Japanese naval power steadily erode. In a letter written in early 1945, he reflected on Midway. "We thought we had been surprised by 3 carriers when we expected none. Now I understand we weren't just surprised by 3 carriers. We were surprised by the entire industrial might of America. The carriers at Midway were just the beginning. What we faced at Midway was a preview of what was coming, a flood of American ships, aircraft, and men that would overwhelm anything we could build or train or deploy." Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, who had spent the war years in various staff and training positions after recovering from his appendicitis, compiled a comprehensive analysis of the Midway intelligence failure in the final months of the war. His report, distributed to a limited group of senior officers, attempted to extract lessons that might be applied in future conflicts, though by that point, everyone understood there would be no future conflicts for Imperial Japan. Fuchida's analysis emphasized that the intelligence failure at Midway wasn't primarily about miscounting carriers, but about misunderstanding the nature of industrial warfare. "We counted ships," Fuchida wrote, "when we should have been counting factories. We assessed training programs when we should have been assessing industrial capacity. We estimated replacement rates when we should have been estimating production potential. Our intelligence told us what America had on June 4, 1942. Our intelligence failed to tell us what America could build, how fast they could build it, and how completely their industrial capacity would reshape the naval balance. That was the real intelligence failure at Midway, not the tactical surprise, but the strategic blindness. The human cost of this strategic blindness extended far beyond ships sunk and the sailors lost. Every battle fought after Midway was fought by Japanese forces that were outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outmatched. Pilots flew obsolete aircraft against superior American planes. Sailors served on ships that lacked adequate fuel, ammunition, and air cover. Soldiers defended islands that American industry had rendered strategically irrelevant. The intelligence services documented all of this, compiled reports, tracked American strength, and provided accurate assessments that confirmed what everyone already knew. The war was lost, had been lost since Midway, perhaps had been lost from the moment it began, given the industrial disparities that intelligence had failed to fully appreciate. In the final months of the war, as American carriers launched strikes against the Japanese home islands with impunity, the question of carrier numbers became almost absurd. Intelligence reports dutifully logged sightings of American carriers off the coast, so many carriers that distinguishing individual ships became pointless. The sea seemed covered with them. The sky seemed filled with their aircraft. The intelligence officers who had once agonized over whether America had 3 carriers or 5 at Midway now watched dozens of carriers operate simultaneously in waters that Japan couldn't defend. Admiral Ugaki, who had calculated after Midway that the mathematics of industrial warfare favored America, wrote in his diary in July of 1945, "The intelligence reports now show more than 30 American carriers operating in waters near Japan. I remember when we thought 3 carriers at Midway was a disaster. 3 carriers. The Americans now deploy 10 times that number. What we feared at Midway has come to pass, but on a scale beyond anything we imagined. Our intelligence failed us not by being wrong about specific numbers, but by failing to help us understand that we were fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity made victory impossible." When the war ended in August of 1945, Japanese intelligence officers began the process of compiling final reports and preparing for occupation. Among the documents prepared for American occupation forces were detailed analyses of Japanese intelligence operations, including frank assessments of where Japanese intelligence had failed. The Midway intelligence failure featured prominently in these reports, not as an excuse but as a case study in how systematic errors in assessment methodology could lead to strategic catastrophe. Commander Nakajima, working on one of these final intelligence assessments, wrote, "We failed at Midway because we assessed our enemy based on our own limitations. We assumed American repair capabilities matched ours. We assumed American industrial capacity operated under constraints similar to ours. We assumed American operational tempo would be limited by the same factors that limited us. Every assumption was wrong. And because our assumptions were wrong from the beginning, every subsequent intelligence assessment built on a flawed foundation." The final irony of the intelligence failure was that Japanese intelligence officers, in the end, probably understood American industrial capacity better than most Americans did. The intelligence reports compiled in the last years of the war contained detailed, accurate assessments of American production capacity, shipyard efficiency, aircraft manufacturing, and pilot training programs. These reports documented American strengths that would shape the entire post-war order. But this understanding came too late to matter, came after the strategic decisions had been made, came after the battles had been fought and lost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.